Thanks for joining me today. This last presentation of the series is entitled Other Reasons for Eating a Whole Food, Plant-Based Diet. Part 2, Our Environment. I'm a big believer in knowledge and power, and my intention is to give you some knowledge to help you help all of us. You know, we live in such a big, beautiful, diverse, and dynamic world. The beauty on Earth is staggering, and we're in trouble because so many people eat so many animals. This presentation about the environment is a hard one. We're dealing with a huge gap in awareness. Large organizations and corporations don't really want us to talk about it. It's challenging, it's depressing, and it feels very big to grapple with, but we must, for our children's sake. This presentation is about how we humans have influenced our environment via animal-based agriculture, specifically our land, air, water, and oceans. We'll also talk about species biodiversity, our health living in such an environment, and the ethics of eating animals, knowing what we know. This session lasts about 50 minutes, and I'll pop back in 2 additional times to recap important points and check in. Now make sure you've reviewed the questions for reflection and discussion first. Have your vegan snack and notebook handy, because here we go.
Every individual can make a difference. This is a far-reaching topic, and there are many excellent books, articles, and resources out there to substantiate this presentation. This session is simply a brief, very brief overview of some of the environmental effects and pollution caused by humans eating animals. This presentation is not about the entire topic of environmentalism or climate change or any of that. This presentation focuses on industrial animal agriculture and how that industry is changing our environment. However, we have to acknowledge it's easy to be overwhelmed and disheartened. We have a very convoluted system run by a few very large global corporate players and politicians who want to maintain the status quo. However, please remember that every day, one person can make a difference by what we choose to put on our plate. Our food choices have a huge impact on the planet. The more of us who eat more plant-based meals, the better for the environment, the animals themselves, and our health. Think of it as living lightly on the earth with an eye toward the future and with a smaller, kinder, more compassionate footprint for our fellow inhabitants. But first we have to address climate change deniers and the scientific consensus on climate change. While we're focusing on just the environmental effects of animal agriculture, I want to briefly address climate change deniers and skeptics, actually only about 20% around the world, by addressing a massive study and book by Harvard professor Naomi Oreskes, a science historian. Dr. Oreskes analyzed 928 peer-reviewed scientific articles published between 1993 and 2003 with the key word climate change. None of these authors' articles disagreed that, number one, yes, climate change does exist, and number two, humans are causing it. That means there is widespread scientific consensus and evidence that human activity is heating the earth, thus greatly influencing global climate change. To quote Dr. Oreskes, politicians, economists, journalists, and others may have the impression of confusion, disagreement, or discord among climate scientists, but that impression is incorrect. In other words, the science is there. It's like gravity. There is agreement among scientists. Sadly, others have corrupted that conversation for their own benefit. From their book's webpage, Merchants of Doubt, historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway explain how a loose-knit group of high-level scientists with extensive political connections ran effective campaigns to mislead the public and deny well-established scientific knowledge over 4 decades. In 7 compelling chapters addressing tobacco, acid rain, the ozone hole, global warming, DDT, Oreskes and Conway show how the ideology of free market fundamentalism, aided by a too-compliant media, has skewed public understanding of some of the most pressing issues of our era. The result is that some people are mixed up regarding climate change as a result of the same strategies of causing doubt and denial that twisted the public's knowledge of the health impacts of tobacco and DDT in the past. Do we want to repeat this cycle of misinformation? Dr. Oresky asks us, what if our grandchildren knew we knew about climate change and we failed to do anything about it? Good question. But we can do something about it every day when we decide what to eat, and we can share this knowledge with our children and their children. There is hope. Dr. Oppenlander shares this vision. Our world has created the most efficient and nourishing food production systems possible. These systems should build and conserve topsoil and soil fertility, while using the least amount of land, water, and other resources. These goals can be accomplished by devoting all agricultural efforts towards purely plant-based systems. No livestock, no dairy, and no chickens. I love the title of his amazing book. I was comfortably unaware of the impact of animal agriculture on climate change until a few years ago. I just didn't know. I thought I was an environmentalist. I wasn't. From his website, Dr. Oppenlander is a consultant and researcher whose award-winning book, Comfortably Unaware, has been endorsed as a must-read by Ellen, Dr. Jane Goodall, and Dr. Nir Barnard, among many others. Since the 1970s, Dr. Oppenlander has studied the effect of our food choices and what effects they have on our health and the immense impact those choices have on our environment. With his work, Dr. Oppenlander addresses the fact that our current choice of food is the leading contributing factor for detrimental climate change. The loss of our land and fresh water, devastation of our oceans, rapid loss of biodiversity and mass extinctions, world hunger and food insecurity, and loss of our own health. Conversely, with newfound global awareness and immediate adoption of a fully plant-based diet and agricultural systems, the highest level of relative sustainability will be achieved, and we will flourish as a civilization. Yes, each of us can do something every day to help alleviate climate change. Next, let's talk briefly and specifically about our land, air, and water. Planet Earth is comprised of about 70% water and about 30% land. Land is limited. We raise and slaughter 70 billion animals a year for 7 billion people to eat on this limited amount of land. These animals, who are animals first and humans food second, require massive amounts of natural resources. Let's talk about that. What shall we do with our land? We've mentioned before how awful factory farms are, and they are horrific, kept under wraps by legislation called ag-gag laws, so we cannot see what truly goes on in there. Livestock now uses 30% of non-ice usable land in the world. And remember, we only have 30% of our planet as land. While in the U.S., half the land mass is used for producing, growing crops, feeding, or dealing with the wastes of animals that people eat. 70% of forests in the Amazon are now used for grazing. But grass-fed cows are not sustainable. While the animals might be happier than those raised in factories, we don't have the land. Cows require 2 to 20 acres per animal, depending on where in the world they live. We have 7 billion people on this planet, soon to be 9 billion people. We simply don't have room to graze on grass animals raised for food. Moreover, grass-fed animals need a longer time, another year, to get bigger before we kill them. So that means more water is consumed and more methane is released through their massive amounts of waste. On 1 acre of land, we can grow 12 to 20 times the amount of edible grains, vegetables, and fruits as animal products. Purely plant-based agricultural systems rebuild the soil over the long term. Planting a wide variety of crops can increase crop yield by 400%. Well, so what are some of the effects of animal ag on our land? Deforestation causes habitat loss for plants, animals, and people. Trees, forest cover, are home to many species, and these are complex, interrelated ecosystems. Overgrazing, 700 million acres have been degraded, which results in a loss of topsoil. Every backyard gardener knows we need topsoil to raise crops. Due to the large amounts of overgrazing on U.S. lands, we've lost about a third of our topsoil. That's 7 billion tons of topsoil. The result is that more of our land is less productive. So we have to add all sorts of chemicals to enrich it, such as pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, which all cause problems on their own. Desertification occurs when soil cannot retain water or grow plants, and the land suffers from rapid erosion by wind and rain. You can see from this infographic that numbers are floating all over the globe. These numbers represent billions of dollars in tax subsidies. Yes, in 2012, $18 billion went directly to just beef and veal subsidies. Over $15 billion went directly to milk producers, while pork producers received $7.3 billion and chicken producers received $6.5 billion. In the past decades, tens of billions of taxpayer dollars are used to provide grain subsidies only to factory farms. These subsidies are not available to farms that raise animals on pasture lands. Right, grass-fed cattle don't receive any subsidies. Meanwhile, the cost of pollution imposed onto us, taxpayers, by these factory farms is in the tens of billions. And while waste created by the animal agricultural sector is a major source of water and air pollution, the agribusiness lobby has repeatedly and occasionally successfully pressed legislators to exempt factory farms from the mandatory reporting required of other major polluting industries. That just isn't right. The only way we're going to affect change in our environment is by demand, consumer action. The more of us who don't buy animal products, the better. We can also pressure our elected officials to respond to their constituents' needs versus industry needs. The air we breathe, greenhouse gas, is made up of 3 poisonous gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These 3 gases impact global warming in a significant manner. Since 1750, carbon dioxide levels have risen 35%, while methane has risen 145%, primarily due to the animal ag industry. Did you know that methane is much more toxic to the ozone layer than carbon dioxide? Yeah, but everybody talks about carbon dioxide when we really should be talking about methane, which is 23 times as destructive as carbon dioxide. Well, then there's nitrous oxide, too. Nitrous oxide is almost 300% more toxic than carbon dioxide. The animal ag industry generates 65% of all human-related nitrous oxide emissions. Quick, guess how many pounds of waste livestock animals excrete per minute in the United States? These animals excrete 5 million pounds of waste per minute, which is 130 times more than all the human waste in the U.S. The animals we raise for consumption in the U.S. create massive amounts of waste filled with antibiotics, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, and other chemicals. The animal ag industry generates 18% of our carbon dioxide emissions versus just 13.5% emissions from the entire transportation system. We breathe more greenhouse gases from the animal ag industry than from all the transportation emissions in the world. So what we eat creates more of a threat to the environment than all the cars, buses, trucks, trains, and airplanes in the world. 37% of methane emissions come from livestock manure, and 65% nitrous oxide pollution is also due to livestock manure. The Independent World Watch Institute reports that 51% of global warming is due to animal agriculture. With animal-based food, aka meat, increasing as developing nations get richer, this is a big stinking mess. Experts all over the world are talking about how economic growth and animal ag are closely linked and how that association needs to be converted to a healthier, more sustainable situation. Let's talk about factory farm air pollution. As everyone knows, in cities and towns, we have sewage treatment plants. Animal agriculture doesn't use sewage treatment plants. Instead of treating this animal waste, it's poured into huge, open cesspools filled with toxins. These toxins release gases into the air. For the local adjacent communities breathing in this polluted air, it's a health hazard. For asthma, bronchitis, diarrhea, heart palpitations, headaches, depression, nosebleeds, even brain damage. For example, animal feedlots in Texas produce more than 7,000 tons of particulate dust containing bacteria, mold, and fungi from feces and food. When these open cesspools of urine and feces are full, they're then sprayed as liquid fertilizer for crops and carried by the wind to local residents and communities. These cesspools emit toxic airborne chemicals that cause inflammatory, immune, and neurological problems in humans. The EPA estimates that 80% of ammonia emissions come from animal waste. You know the smell. It burns your lungs. There's much more we could say.
We started out this session with the idea that we can do something about it. Yeah, we can. I feel better knowing that I'm helping in my own small way by reaching out to you to share this information, as well as continue to eat only plant-based foods. By not eating animals, we're helping reduce air, land, and water pollution. We're reducing the huge negative environmental effects of the animal agriculture industry. We are consumers voting with our purchases and walking away from the corporations that produce unhealthy foods and ruin our planet. Our land is overused, overgrazed, and less productive. Whole species are losing their habitat. We breathe more greenhouse gases from the animal ag industry than from all the transportation emissions in the world. So what we eat creates more of a threat to the environment than all the cars, buses, trucks, trains, and airplanes in the world. Crazy, isn't it? Our precious water is both scarce and contaminated, as we'll discuss next. Animals require huge amounts of water to survive. Another massive amount of water needed to kill, butcher, and process them so people can eat them, because as you can imagine, slaughterhouses are filthy places.
We've all seen the photos of the adorable fluffy baby polar bears in distress due to a reduction of their icy habitat. It's heartbreaking and very real. As our Earth's temperature rises due to the emissions of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide gases, the polar ice caps are shrinking. Estimates vary, but some say so much ice will melt that we will experience an increase of up to 1 meter, that's 39 inches, we will experience an increase of up to 1 meter of ocean this century. That can cause flooding. Today, the Arctic Ocean ice is the smallest in recorded history. The Greenland ice fields are also rapidly melting. They lost more ice in 2012 than all the ice combined in the Swiss Alps. Everyone knows that California is suffering from a 4-year drought, the worst in 1,200 years, and residents have been asked to cut back watering lawns and to take short showers. Yet California is also the leading dairy producer in the United States. Annual gross profits are about $5 billion. Surprisingly, the dairy industry has not been asked to restrict water usage, despite the many hidden uses of water we forget about in industrial animal agriculture. For example, first water has to be used to produce feed for the livestock, and that's mostly corn and soy, which require quite a bit of water. Then water to hydrate the cows, 50 gallons per day, and finally lots of water to keep the processing plant clean. 700 cows at a typical plant uses 3.4 million gallons of water per day. 80% of California water goes to agriculture. Large-scale farmers are exempt from restrictions during this 4-year drought. 50% of the fresh water used in the United States is for the animal ag industry. 400 gallons is used at the slaughterhouse to kill, butcher, and process 1 cow. Cows drink 50 gallons of water per day. 1 pound of beef represents 1,800 gallons of water, while 468 gallons represents 1 pound of chicken, and 576 gallons for 1 pound of bacon or pork. 1 pound of nuts require 4.5 cubic feet of water. Beans require less, 2 cubic feet, and vegetables, even less, 0.15 cubic feet of water. So here's the big takeaway. 1 gram of beef protein requires 6 times as much water as 1 gram of protein from beans, peas, or lentils. Increases in urbanization, consumption, industrialization, and population are all interrelated in the conversation about humans' responsibility towards climate change. By 2050, experts say we'll need 50% more water when our population increases from 7 to 9 billion people. Right now, 1.2 billion people live where water is scarce. This isn't getting any better. Are we saying by our actions that those 1+ billion people are less important than the animals people eat? As developing nations, like China and India, for example, become more successful, their standard of living changes along with growing disdain for their traditional vegetarian diet, which they forego for Western animal-based nutrition instead. The former environmental minister of Brazil, Lizzie O'Leary, said, quote, "We have all the elements of a perfect storm, except we don't have water." The parts of that perfect storm include rising numbers of people, rising incomes, rising consumption, lack of resources, and lack of poverty alleviation. And that country could be bracing for water riots, and she is not alone in her worry. Wow, water riots. Well, that's scary. Well, let's talk about drinking water for just a minute. Drinking water pollution. What would we do if our civic leaders told us our community had run out of fresh drinking water due to the pollution caused from the animal ag industry? This would include raising of food for the animals as well as all the water used in the killing, butchering, and processing. In 2015, the city of Toledo, Ohio, is experiencing a record-setting algae bloom in Lake Erie that costs millions of dollars to filter and process so the water is safe for drinking. It's a risk to swimmers and a nuisance to boaters. Lake Erie used to be really polluted by all the heavy metal Rust Belt industry that occurred around the city of Toledo, Detroit, and the Midwest. Now the lake and local citizens are again under siege because of excessive runoff from fertilizers used on feed for animal agriculture, specifically corn and soybeans. These are threatening the drinking and bathing water of residents. Well, who wants to bathe their infant in toxic water or drink it? This pollution is caused by an excess nutrients from fertilizer, manure, and sewage. Citizens have to rely on bottled water. Incidentally, the Clean Water Act doesn't monitor most agriculture operations because they're not what's called on-point pollution sources, meaning there isn't a pipeline pushing the pollution out. Instead, the pollution leaks out and runs off. Ohio and Iowa are in similar distress due to massive amounts of fertilizer used on corn for animal ag. Speaking of Iowa, let's add Missouri and you get more than 50 million pigs and only 8 million people. Think of the urine, excrement, and the greenhouse gases they produce, plus all the natural resources those animals require in just 2 states. These waterborne pollutants work their way via the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, where the world's largest algae bloom is the size of Connecticut, is located, creating a dead zone without any plants or animals. The UN says there are 150 dead zones in the world, all caused by excess nitrogen from farm fertilizers and sewage. And that leads us to fishless oceans. Fishless oceans by 2050? We talk more about fishing in the animals session, so right now, let me just say a few things about the polluting effects of industrial fishing. The EPA tells that 100% of freshwater fish samples in the U.S. contain mercury, and ocean fish samples contain heavy metals, PCBs, highly toxic cancer-causing chemicals. And don't forget antibiotics. If people eat fish, they ingest those chemicals. Due to industrial fishing practices, fishing lines, Weights and nets entangle, kill wildlife and birds. Massive drift nets accelerate species extinction via bykill. The nonprofit Oceana organization recently published a report about bycatch or bykill. Bykill is when other animals like sea turtles, baby fish, dolphins, and seabirds are caught along with the target fish. Annually, commercial fishermen across the world bring in approximately 160 billion pounds of marine catch. So that's 400 million pounds per day, and 40% of that 400 million pound catch is discarded, dead, or maimed fish, which are left to die back in the ocean. That equals 16 million pounds of dead, maimed sea life per day. Our oceans are depleted and under severe stress. Our large stockfish is 10% of what it was in the 1950s due to industrial fishing practices. Some scientists predict we could have fishless oceans by 2050. Because of consumer demand, we've already eaten all the wild fish, so now enterprising corporations have developed fish farms. Picture 90,000 fish in a pen that's approximately 100 feet by 100 feet. Connected together, fish farms can easily raise 1 million fish in a relatively small space. Fish farms are plagued with parasites and disease. They contaminate local ecosystems. The water around fish farms are full of fish feces, uneaten food, antibiotics, and chemicals that pollute waterways. To make matters worse, farmed fish require wild fish for food. Yes, 3 pounds of wild fish is needed for every 1 pound of farmed shrimp or salmon. And we can't forget livestock in factory farms. 1/3 of all the fish caught are used as fish meal for livestock. Now, fish-eating cows just seems wrong, though, doesn't it? As we wrap up the sections about land, air, and water, please think about this information as you consider the health of our animals and our food supply. Dealing with animal waste is a huge problem. Farmed animals produce 130 times the amount of waste than the entire world population. Where does that waste go? Open-air cesspools aren't regulated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Contents of these cesspools are sprayed on fields and drift to neighboring areas, creating more air and water pollution. Many of us know how antibiotic resistance is a growing problem. One reason is because chickens only metabolize about 20% of the antibiotics given to them. 80% ends up in their waste, and we know where that goes. Factory farmed animals produce about 3 trillion tons of waste per year. A dairy farm with 2,500 cows generates as much urine and feces as a city of over 400,000 people. Waste is used to fertilize crops, leaches into our waterways full of antibiotics, bacteria, and even arsenic. The Union for Concerned Scientists is the leading science-based nonprofit working for a healthy environment and a safer world. They recently issued a report, The Greatest Potential for Reducing Land Use Emissions, saying that damaging land use, which includes deforestation, methane from cattle, and nitrogen from over-fertilization, can and must be reduced so that we can avoid the worst consequences of climate change. We could mitigate emissions by decreasing emissions from livestock, which is raising fewer animals to eat, or raising no animals to eat, decreasing emissions from fertilizer, which is using organic, sustainable, healthy options, reducing food waste, reducing consumption of high-emission foods like beef, and increasing reforestation. We can do this. You can do this, and there is hope. Biodiversity and our own personal health are up next. We live in a wonderfully diverse world with many interrelated species. Insects, birds, and bats pollinate flowers and feed on pests. Microbial species live in soil, on plants, and serve to recycle nutrients and to facilitate in the uptake of water on other nutrients. There are numerous mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and fish. Food chains are robust and complex in healthy ecosystems, but we're upsetting this delicate balance very quickly. Biodiversity loss can specifically mean that habitats are changed and or overexploited. There's pollution, invasive species crowd out natives, and of course climate change, raging superstorms, and fires, some of which we'll briefly discuss here. Cattle grazing in the U.S. contributes to 26% of our threatened endangered animal species. A lot of people in the U.S. love horses. We have deep affinity for horses with our cultural heritage. Did you know that wild horses, wolves, and other wildlife are being poisoned, trapped, and shot from helicopters so that cattle can graze on public lands, which we pay for, and also people can eat more animal? I wonder if more people knew, would they be horrified too? Cattle corporations rule because of the consumer demand. If we decide to eat less animal-based food, fewer animals would be raised for food, and fewer other large, beautiful animals, like these horses here, would be killed at taxpayer expense on public lands. We're in awe of the Amazon rainforest and its colorful, interesting, and unique wildlife. Are we in awe enough to actually do something? Deforestation due to cattle ranching is the main reason for loss of plant and animal life. 1 to 2 acres of rainforest are cleared every minute. 91% of this destruction is due to the animal agriculture. The problem with deforestation is far-reaching. First, animals and people are displaced. Second, the land is susceptible to erosion and then to eventual desertification. It's interesting to note that most rainforest land is only viable for about 8 years before it's depleted, spent, useless, thus wasted. 95% of Brazil's Atlantic Ocean coast rainforest is now gone. 110 animals and insect species are lost per day in the rainforest. The 6th extinction, have you heard of that? The largest mass extinction in 65 million years is occurring now. There's a new Pulitzer Prize-winning book out called The 6th Extinction, written by Elizabeth Kolbert. Its premise is that right now, our planet Earth, our home, is experiencing a mass species extinction similar to when the dinosaurs roamed over 66 million years ago. She estimates the loss of flora and fauna to be about 50% of all living species on Earth by the end of the 21st century. Paleontologist Anthony Baronsky at UC Berkeley thinks it'll be worse. He estimates that we'll lose 75% of the species on Earth by the end of the 21st century. Quibbling over 50 or 75% is beside the point. It's all too much. Now keep in mind, a species is essentially the whole group, the whole large group of living creatures capable of interbreeding with each other. Dogs and elephants are different species, while poodles and pit bulls are the same species. To put this into perspective, for example, since 1900, we have lost 477 entire species of vertebrates. That includes mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. Scientists say it's not too late, and we can curb these terrifying extinction rates. We must act quickly. 50 years ago, 15% of the Earth was covered with rainforest. Today, less than 2% of Earth is covered with rainforest. Numerous medicines are derived from rainforests, such as prescriptions for muscle relaxants used in surgery, birth control, arthritis, asthma, heart medicine, malaria, pneumonia, bronchitis, dysentery, Hodgkin's disease, leukemia, and other cancer-fighting drugs. Modern farmers only grow 15 plant species for 90% of animal feed, thus reducing plant diversity and undermining local ecosystems. The kind of plant-based food available for us to eat, for animals to eat, is vast. Yet we rely on a few stalwarts. The total number of plant species in the world is estimated at 270,000. Now remember that species are different than varieties or types. For example, there are thousands of varieties of bananas, Approximately 1,000 to 2,000 species of plants are edible by humans. About 100 to 200 species of plants play an important role in world commerce, and only about 15 species provide the majority of food crops, and those would be things like soybeans, peanuts, rice, wheat, and bananas. When we limit eating so many different types of plants, we limit and undermine our health and the health of our ecosystems. We need to plant, harvest, and eat a wide variety of plants for strength and vitality in our bodies and our ecosystems. When we don't plant a variety of crops, it's called monoculture, and that's what we have now. It's very unhealthy and not sustainable. Harvard scientists write, genetic diversity in crops reduces the odds of crop failure secondary to changing weather. Genetic diversity protects against the spread of plant diseases and pests and can lead to greater crop yields. When we just plant crops of the same type, like acres of corn, it isn't smart. These giant agro-businesses are depleting our earth. The old-fashioned farms that plant a little bit of everything are the smartest, most effective way to farm. Now, we also have to deal with the fact that almost 25% of the world's plants are nearing extinction. In summary, it's a vicious cycle. Livestock stimulate the release of gases that hasten global warming while making our environment more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, like severe weather, droughts, floods, and extreme rates of fluctuations in temperature.
During this last bit, we talked about water pollution due to animal waste, fertilizer runoff, antibiotics, and chemicals. Both fish farms and industrial fishing are exploiting our oceans. Fresh, clean drinking water is also likely to be scarce with so many billions more people in the world. But there's hope! As numerous scientists have said, it's not too late. And we can reclaim our home, our planet Earth, for our children's children. Yes, it will take effort, and yes, we can do this. We're now going to shift our attention to our personal health and then to the ethics of eating animals, knowing what we know about the environment and the animal agriculture. We'll also journey on a thought experiment, asking the question, what would happen if the entire world went vegan? We close out this session with a plea for action. Yes, there is hope, but we do need to act today and save dwindling natural resources and wildlife by eating more plants. The plant-based vegan diet has the smallest, lowest carbon footprint. After the session, please do go back to the questions for reflection and discussion, and spend some time thinking, what can you do? What kind of world do you want to leave for your children's children?
Poor health is also linked to environmental factors, and we've talked about it a little bit already. Climate change leads to more intense and frequent weather events like floods, droughts, extreme heat, and storms, which we continue to see around the world. Very briefly, and this is just simply terrible for our health, a recent study published in the prestigious Journal of American Medical Association searched for 5 years' worth of articles about climate change and health published between the years 2009 and 2014, and studied a number of other government reports and climate data. They write that extreme heat causes heat-related disorders such as heat stress, reduced work capacity, respiratory disorders, asthma, infectious diseases, waterborne diseases, and mental health disorders such as depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. Keep in mind that aging populations, like we have in many developed countries, are also more susceptible to air pollution and are more at risk than younger people for health problems such as heart attack and stroke. Regarding air pollution, another study published in the Stroke Journal found that air pollution actually changes our brain structure, which can lead to aging, thus reducing the size of our brain, which is called atrophy. People with the highest exposures had the highest incidence of silent strokes. While researchers in Australia, where there's lots of fires and a lot of drought, report an increase in cardiovascular events like heart attacks from people breathing the smoke from out-of-control wildfires. There's much more to discuss in the realm of public health. I just wanted to mention it very briefly today, so we didn't forget about it. Our last topic will be the ethics of eating animals, knowing that we are contributing to climate change and animal extinction on a grand scale. Animal agriculture is terrible for animals and workers. This is more than an ethical, humanitarian, social justice issue. It's an economic one. Working in an animal agriculture factory, farm, slaughterhouse, or processing plant is brutal work. Most people won't work in those places, even faced with unemployment. It's physically hard, and the pay is about $10 to $12 an hour. The work also involves torturing and killing animals, which many of us are loath to do. The smell is overpowering. The air is unbreathable. The buildings, hidden from plain view, are filthy with blood, fluids, feces, and polluted water streaming everywhere. Unlike migrant workers who can obtain a work permit for seasonal agricultural jobs, foreign workers can't get the H-2A visa because their jobs are year-round rather than temporary. It's a huge immigration problem and affects the entire animal ag industry. Most of these workers are terrified of losing their jobs, which at about $23,000 a year is about at the poverty line. Labor laws don't always hold up either. Investigators have found teenagers as young as 15 working in these plants. As people think about their food, their meat, their dairy, cheese, and ice cream, I simply ask you to also think about the people who make that food possible. Most of us don't think about who exactly produces our food. I think it's time we do. Are these workers treated with respect for doing the work no one else wants to do? No, they're not. Factory farm workers have the highest turnover rate in the United States. 38% don't speak English. 48% don't have legal authorization to work in this country. They are at-will employees and can be fired at any time. Workers with 5 years' experience have a 50% chance of injury. 167 workers per day suffer lost work time injuries. 70% suffer from respiratory disorders. And in 2012, there were 20 deaths per 100,000 workers. One final example is that we know that inorganic arsenic is added to chicken feed for about 70% of U.S. chickens. Right now, over 100 residents in Arkansas have been diagnosed with arsenic poisoning that has led to blood diseases and rare forms of cancer. Factory farm workers' health is severely compromised every day by these practices. In addition to the misery and human toll of these working conditions, who pays for their care? What happens to these families? There are numerous public health and economic questions to ask. These are part of the ethical considerations to address when eating animal-based food. Just what is our responsibility? Let's think for a minute. Environmental vegans focus on the conservation of resources like land and water. Eating animals is not sustainable due to our population. We have to come to terms with feeding the increases in populations when we talk about the environment. In the year 1812, the world had about 1 billion people. In the year 1912, 1.5 billion people. And in the year 2012, we have 7 billion people. We are projected to have 9 billion people by 2050. Keep in mind, however, our current practices for raising food are very inefficient regardless of how many people we have on Earth. Deforestation displaces native peoples and animals suffer extinction. Is that what we really want? I don't think so. I think more people just need to be more aware of the consequences. You know, we produce enough food to feed twice as many people as there are on Earth, which is 14 billion people. Well, where does that food go? Well, to the animals people eat, of course. Grain and other foodstuffs could be used to feed humans instead of animals. Today, 870 million people suffer from hunger in our world. 6 million children will die of starvation. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in 2013, more than 49 million Americans lived in households struggling against hunger. Of them, over 15 million were children, and that's over 20% of all children struggling with hunger in the United States. Previously, in 2012, a little over 48 million Americans lived in food-insecure households. Our numbers are going up. It's not a good thing. Eating animal products leads to chronic disease, which affects families on a personal level and the healthcare industry on an organizational level. Healthcare is a huge topic and touches many aspects of our lives. Developing countries are sacrificing valuable land and water to increase animal agriculture for other countries. While this occurs all over the world, it's most significant in South America and sub-Saharan Africa, where forests are slashed for grazing lands. We need to think about who eats what and why. In June of 2015, Pope Francis issued the first encyclical letter ever written about our stewardship of the planet Earth, our common home. The Pope attacked the consumerism and wastefulness of modern life, linking stewardship of the natural world with justice for the, quote, poorest and most vulnerable people, unquote, and calling for a transformation of economic systems and political policies in order to avert environmental catastrophe. He reminded us that the world's most vulnerable bear the greatest environmental burdens and are most adversely affected by climate change. With the Pope's well-publicized encyclical, he has converted climate change into a moral and ethical issue. He asks, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? Well, here's a really good question. What if everyone in the world stopped eating animals and animal food products? Let's take a leap forward. We know that the animal agriculture industry is a massive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, takes up valuable land, contributes to species extinction, animal torture, pollution, poor health, and a host of other problems, as we've discussed in each of these sessions. We also know that no government has taken on the animal ag industry, as they have the energy and transport industry, for a host of reasons. It's not an insurmountable problem, though. Many changes in behavior have come about because people wanted something and took action. As a thought experiment, let's speculate what would happen if everyone in the world was a vegan by the year 2050. Let's enjoy some blue sky thinking, courtesy of a research team in the Netherlands. They've published their findings, which include global veganism would reduce carbon emissions by 17%, methane emissions by 24%, nitrous oxide emissions by 21%, and at lower cost than energy-focused interventions like carbon taxes and renewable energy. New land would be available. Approximately 10 million square miles of land could be used for other purposes. Antibiotic resistance infections would significantly decrease worldwide. By the year 2050, the world population is projected to be 9 billion people. By 2100, we're projected to have 11 billion people versus our 7 billion now. What will people eat and where will they live? Food production will need to increase 70%. Do we have enough water for people? We can't answer these questions today, but perhaps think about it. Talk about it with your friends and family. Learn more. We have no choice. We're going to have to figure it out. So how will we feed our world? Paul Ehrlich from Stanford University and John Hart from the University of California, Berkeley, have recently written a new report that addresses how we can ensure that billions of people around the world have enough to eat. To quote, economic equality, population growth, and environmental health are all linked. They recommend that governments must reduce the whole system to avoid future famine. This means limiting greenhouse gases that warm the planet, avoiding biodiversity losses specifically due to deforestation and land conversions, overgrazing, and degradation of grasslands and desertification. It means we must cut back on pesticides and antibiotics to grow food. It means we must move climate change to the top of the agenda and end incentives to pull fossil fuels out of the ground. Both professors say that there are solutions out there, that researchers, scientists, and engineers are working on these problems. But some of our politicians are not facing these very real issues. So in summary, we've talked about many issues. Let's wrap up now so you can go enjoy a well-deserved, delicious, plant-based snack or meal. Dr. Oppenlander urges us to remember that moderate projections for consumption and depletion speculate that we'll need 2 planet Earths by the year 2030 unless we act fast. Right now, our global carbon footprint is 30% more than we can sustain, so we're in debt to the Earth. And this is the mess we leave for our children unless we decide we don't want to. We know that consumer demand and individual action is very powerful. Think about it. What will you do today? The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, a federally appointed panel of nutritionists created in 1983, are working now in the first half of 2015 to revise the dietary guidelines that inform school lunches, the military, and other federal meal programs. The 500-page report says the average U.S. diet has a larger environmental impact in terms of increased greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, and energy use than the healthy dietary pattern it suggests, one that's rich in vegetables, fruit, whole grains, legumes, and nuts. It's great news. In its review of scientific studies, the committee highlighted research concluding that a vegan diet has the most potential health benefits and the lowest impact on our world, our limited resources. To quote the report, the organically grown vegan diet has the lowest estimated impact on resources and ecosystem quality. Additionally, beef was the single food with the greatest projected impact on the environment. Other foods estimated to have high impact include cheese, milk, and seafood. Federal agencies will develop and publicize the federal guidelines from the advisory committee sometime in the second half of 2015. We can all step into action and save dwindling natural resources and wildlife by eating more plants. You can easily see by looking at this graph that a vegan diet has the smallest, lowest carbon footprint. A person who follows a vegan diet, a healthy vegan diet, produces 50% less carbon dioxide, uses 1/11 of oil, 1/13 of water, and 1/18 of land compared to an animal eater. The more of us do this, the better for our home planet. Just to refresh your memory from all the other sessions, here's an example of a whole food, plant-based food plate. If this is new to you, check out all the other sessions and look at my website for more details. In conclusion, enjoy eating more plants and sharing this very important information with your friends and family. Thanks for joining me today to learn more about the vast environmental concerns that we can alleviate by choosing to eat more plant-based foods. It's my sincere hope that you can take this information and continue to learn more as you continue to integrate more plant-based meals into you and your family's regular nutrition. We can all talk about this vital topic in our daily lives and start shifting awareness that a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet is the new normal. Please visit my website, howtoescapeheartdisease.com, and Facebook page for more information and resources. Happy eating!